Now, I'm not as animated as your two previous speakers, so I'm going to stand right behind this desk so I don't deviate from my prepared remarks. And I hope you guys are coming back that are running out to the water fountain or restroom or whatever, because I think you're going to want to hear what I have to say. I want to talk about libertarianism and the war on drugs. I'm grateful for the invitation to speak tonight about a subject that I not only feel very passionate about, but a subject that I have continually written about for a number of years. So thank you, students, for coming to this program. I want to talk about one of the most senseless, wasteful, and destructive things that I can think of, the government's war on drugs. Which government? All of them, federal, state, and local. Let me begin by making three statements that might on the surface seem to be quite radical. Number one, the war on drugs is a monstrous evil that has ruined more lives than drugs themselves. Number two, the war on drugs is a war on the free market, a free society, and freedom itself. And number three, all drugs, not just marijuana, should be perfectly legal. If you oppose drugs, then you should oppose the war on drugs even more. If you consider drugs to be dangerous, then you should consider the war on drugs to be even more dangerous. If you believe that drug use is destructive, then you should believe that the war on drugs is even more destructive. If you think that using drugs is immoral, then you should think that the war on drugs is even more immoral. If you regard buying drugs to be a colossal waste of money, then you should regard the war on drugs to be even more of a waste of money. If you reason that abusing drugs is a sin, then you should reason that the war on drugs is an even greater sin. Now, it is unfortunate that whenever I speak about the drug war, I have to begin by explaining that I don't say the things I do because I want to use illegal drugs. So let me make myself perfectly clear. I neither use nor sell nor recommend mind-altering, behavior-altering, or mood-altering substances, nor would I if they were legal. I am even skeptical about the health benefits of most legal drugs, prescription or over-the-counter. I have no agenda other than the defense of personal freedom and the establishment of a free society. Now, even though I consider the use of any drug for any reason other than because of a medical necessity to be dangerous, destructive, and immoral, I consider the government's war on drugs to be even more dangerous, destructive, and immoral. And even though I neither advocate nor condone the use of mind-altering, behavior-altering, or mood-altering substances, I don't think anyone should support the government's war on drugs any more than they should support the government's war on obesity or cholesterol or trans fat or salt or liquids over 3.4 ounces on airline flights. Okay, now that you're certain that I don't want Americans to be high all the time, I can talk about libertarianism and the war on drugs. I want to first look at the drug war. Then I want to introduce you to libertarianism. And finally, I want to tell you what libertarianism says about the drug war. Then I want to conclude by asking you two important questions. All right, first of all, the drug war. The war on drugs was officially announced by President Richard Nixon in 1971. Speaking at a press conference at the White House, Nixon declared, "America's public enemy, number one in the United States, is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive." He continued his military rhetoric in a special message to Congress on drug abuse and prevention, calling for a full-scale attack on drug abuse on many fronts. To wage an effective war against heroin addiction, he called for a worldwide escalation in our existing programs for the control of narcotics traffic. Nixon also appointed the first drug czar and oversaw the establishment of the Drug Enforcement Agency, the dreaded DEA. Now, although the war on drugs was formally declared by Nixon, this doesn't mean that the federal government didn't fight against drugs and drug abuse for decades before Nixon's presidency. Yet, the federal government did not begin introducing anti-narcotics laws until 1905. This means that there was a long time in this country's history when all drugs were perfectly legal. Just like you were once free to have a garage sale without getting a permit. But what about marijuana? Haven't 30 states legalized marijuana for medical use? Haven't 21 states decriminalized the possession of certain amounts of marijuana? Haven't 9 states legalized the recreational use of marijuana? These things are certainly true, but there are 3 problems that I should point out about this. Number 1, it is only laws against marijuana that have been relaxed. You can still be locked in a cage for possessing other drugs. Number 2, the repeal of some marijuana laws is not marijuana freedom. There are still massive restrictions and regulations regarding marijuana in the states that have legalized it for medical or recreational use. And number 3, the federal government considers the growing, distributing, buying, selling, or smoking of marijuana to be a violation of federal law. Marijuana is still classified as a Schedule I controlled substance with a high potential for abuse and no acceptable medical use. So regardless of how some states have relaxed their marijuana laws, the federal war on drugs continues unabated and unquestioned. It enjoys wide bipartisan support in Congress. It is equally supported by both major political parties, Democrat and Republican. It is backed by the majority of Americans. It is cheered by most religious people. It is espoused by most parents with young children. It is championed by liberals and conservatives alike. It is encouraged by the majority of law enforcement personnel. It is even defended by those who say they abdicate the Constitution or civil liberties or limited government. The gross injustices and absurdities of the drug war are legion. Some Americans have been sentenced to life in prison for drug possession because it was their 3rd offense. There are murderers and rapists who don't serve life in prison. You can get the death penalty for, quote, manufacturing, importing, or distributing a controlled substance if the act was commanded as part of a continuing criminal enterprise. That's a quote from federal law. Thanks to the war on drugs and civil asset forfeiture laws, police regularly practice policing for profit, whereby they confiscate cash from law-abiding Americans, because having a large sum of money on you must mean that you're into drug trafficking. And then there are the outrages that are generally not seen. Americans incarcerated for drug offenses who are raped, beaten, humiliated, and suffer the loss of their jobs, their money, and their families. And drug warriors maintain that it is drug users who are the ones who are immoral. It is the war on drugs that is responsible for the incarceration of so many Americans, and especially non-white Americans. Mass incarceration as a result of the drug war has reduced educational and employment opportunities for Black Americans and made them fear and hate the police. Conservatives like to say that America is the exceptional nation. Well, the United States is indeed an exceptional nation. It has less than 5% of the world's population, but almost a quarter of the world's prisoners. The United States has over 2 million people behind bars, more than any other country. And it has the highest per capita prison rate. Half of all federal prisoners and 20% of all state prisoners are incarcerated solely because of drug crimes. In a nutshell, what is the war on drugs? It is simply government bureaucrats, nanny state do-gooders, puritanical busybodies, statist drug warriors, and assorted hypocrites telling you what you can and can't consume, swallow, smoke, sniff, snort, inject, or ingest, and locking you up in a cage if you possess, manufacture, process, buy, sell, distribute, transport, cultivate, or traffic in a substance the government doesn't approve of. Now let's talk about libertarianism. I'm a libertarian. I'm not a composite of a liberal and a conservative, as if there really is much difference nowadays in practice between the two. I lean neither to the right nor the left, but neither am I a centrist or a moderate. I'm not a constitutionalist, although I wish the government would make some attempt to follow its own constitution. So what is libertarianism? Libertarianism has been defined as an ethical system that seeks to preserve the liberty of individuals and as a political philosophy concerned with the permissible use of force or violence. These are two sides of the same coin. Libertarianism is the philosophy which says that people should be free from individual, societal, or government interference to live their lives any way they desire, pursue their own happiness, accumulate as much wealth as they can, assess their own risks, make their own choices, engage in commerce with anyone who is willing to reciprocate, participate in any economic activity for their profit, and spend the fruits of their labor as they see fit, as long as their actions are peaceful, their associations are voluntary, their interactions are consensual, and they don't violate the personal or property rights of others. Libertarianism respects personal and financial privacy, free thought, freedom of conscience, and private property. Libertarianism insists on individual responsibility, free exchange, free markets, free enterprise, free assembly, free association, free speech, and free expression. Libertarianism celebrates individual liberty, personal freedom, peaceful activity, consensual acts, and voluntary interaction, as long as these things don't violate the personal or property rights of others. Libertarianism is not being socially liberal and economically conservative. It is not survival of the fittest. It is not unbridled capitalism. Libertarianism is not selfishness, greed, or anarchy, or hedonism. Whether any of these things are right or wrong, moral or immoral, ethical or unethical, or good or bad is irrelevant. Libertarianism has nothing to do with anyone's lifestyle, tastes, vices, sex life, traditions, religion, or social attitude. An individual libertarian might be a moral relativist, as might an individual liberal or an individual conservative. But libertarianism as a political philosophy cannot be said to be immoral. No political ideology has a monopoly on vice, immorality, bad habits, or questionable behavior. The creed of libertarianism is non-aggression. Freedom from aggression and violence against person and property, as long as one respects the person and property of others. The non-aggression principle is designed to prohibit someone from infringing upon the liberty of another. Aggression is theft, fraud, the initiation of non-consensual violence, or the threat of non-consensual violence. It is wrong to threaten or to initiate violence against a person or his property without his permission. Violence is only justified against violence. No violence should be used against a non-aggressor. Force is only justified in defense or retaliation. And although it must be proportional, force is neither essential nor required. Now, I don't know of anyone who wouldn't readily assent to the non-aggression principle until you bring government into the picture. Many people who say that they subscribe to the non-aggression principle on a personal level have no problem supporting government aggression against their neighbors. The major difference between libertarians and liberals, progressives, moderates, conservatives, and everyone else is that libertarians oppose and seek to limit the intervention, regulation, and control of government. Which, after all, I don't need to tell you this, government is the greatest violator of the non-aggression principle, personal liberty and property rights. This is why Voltaire could say, government at its best state is a necessary evil, and at its worst state is an intolerable one. If there's one thing aside from its simplicity that makes libertarianism the ideal political philosophy, it is its consistency. Libertarianism strictly applies the non-aggression principle and consistently applies to government actions the same standard. This is because libertarians consider the non-aggression principle to be both absolute in scope and universal in application. In a libertarian society, that is, in a free society, the only possible legitimate functions of government are defense, judicial, and policing activities. But this does not require anything like the authoritarian, intrusive nanny state that the U.S. federal and state governments have become. Henry David Thoreau, someone you may study here in college, said he agreed with this motto, that government is best which governs least. And libertarians would certainly agree with him. In a free society, the function of government, in whatever form it might exist, would be limited to keeping the peace, providing a forum for dispute resolution, constraining those who would attempt to interfere with people's peaceful actions, and prosecuting and exacting restitutions from those individuals who initiate violence against, commit fraud against, or violate the property rights of others. In a free society, actions are only prohibited that involve the initiation of violence or aggression against person or property. Libertarians maintain that as long as people don't infringe upon the liberty of others by committing or threatening to commit acts of fraud, theft, aggression, or violence against their person or property, the government should just leave people alone. Why am I a libertarian? Unlike the typical liberal or conservative, I don't believe it is appropriate for the government to do any of these three things that I want to mention. Number one, to arrest, fine, imprison, or otherwise punish people for engaging in entirely private, peaceful, voluntary, and consensual actions that do not aggress against the person or property of others. Number two, I don't think it's appropriate for the government to regulate, oversee, or prohibit commercial activity between willing buyers and willing sellers. And three, I don't think it's appropriate for the government to take people's resources against their will and redistribute them to other people as the government sees fit. All right, libertarianism and the drug war. Libertarians may have their disagreements, but if there's one thing they are unanimous on, it is the monstrous evil that is the war on drugs. Not so, say liberals and conservatives. The drug war is necessary because drugs are addictive, they're unhealthy, they're dangerous, they're a bad habit, they're self-destructive. Yes, they are, says the libertarian. Drugs are addictive, just like caffeine. Drugs are unhealthy, just like high fructose corn syrup. Drugs are dangerous, just like snowboarding. Drugs are a bad habit, like biting your fingernails. Drugs are self-destructive, like smoking cigarettes. So why are liberals and conservatives not adamant about the government sending people to prison for these things? Why just focus on the drugs? But, continues the liberal and the conservative, using drugs may lead to premature death. Oh, you mean like using alcohol, replies the libertarian? But using drugs may cause harm to children. You mean like divorce, says the libertarian? But using drugs has societal costs. You mean like obesity, says the libertarian? But using drugs may lead to financial ruin. You mean like using too many credit cards, says the libertarian? But using drugs may lead to crime. You mean like gambling can? But using drugs may have unintended consequences. You mean like having casual sex? But using drugs may kill you, says the liberal and conservative. The libertarian simply says, you mean like using prescription drugs can kill you that are perfectly legal? Now, regarding drug use, libertarians reason that it makes no sense for the government to wage war on illegal drugs when tobacco, alcohol, and prescription drugs kill far more people every year. Tobacco use costs the U.S. economy billions of dollars every year in medical costs and lost productivity, and causes hundreds of thousands of premature deaths. This is tobacco. Hundreds of thousands of premature deaths every year from heart disease, stroke, cancer, and smoking-related diseases. Then there's alcohol. It's one of the leading causes of premature deaths in the United States. Alcohol abuse is a factor in drownings, suicides, fires, violent crimes, child abuse, sex crimes, and accidents. More than 100,000 Americans die every year from drugs prescribed and administered by physicians. More than 2 million Americans a year have in-hospital adverse drug reactions. And hundreds of Americans die every year from reactions to pain relievers. Why doesn't the federal government declare war on pain relievers? Why the drugs? Two of the main reasons why libertarians have this attitude toward drug use is that in a free society, vices are not crimes, and people are free to live their lives any way they choose, as long as their conduct is peaceful. First of all, in a free society, every crime would have a tangible and identifiable victim, not a potential or possible victim. And every crime would have measurable damages. There would be no such thing as nebulous crimes against nature, against society, or against the state. Having bad habits exercising poor judgment, engaging in dangerous activities, and committing vices are not crimes. Government attempts to protect people from these things always leads to greater evils. And second, in a free society, individuals, not government bureaucrats, are free to decide what risks they are willing to take and what behaviors they want to engage in. Every individual is free to pursue happiness in his own way, even if his choices are deemed by others as harmful, unhealthy, unsafe, immoral, unwise, stupid, destructive, or irresponsible. What people do in the privacy of their own homes or on their property is their business, as long as their actions don't infringe upon the rights of others. Libertarians are weary of pointing out the failures of the war on drugs. It has failed to prevent or reduce drug abuse. It has failed to keep drugs out of the hands of addicts. It has failed to keep drugs away from teenagers and children. It has failed to reduce the demand for drugs. It has failed to stop the violence associated with drug trafficking. It has failed to help drug addicts get treatment. It has failed to end drug overdoses. And the war on drugs has failed to have an impact on the availability of most drugs in the United States. But libertarians also acknowledge the successes of the war on drugs. The war on drugs has succeeded in destroying personal and financial privacy. It has succeeded in destroying the Fourth Amendment. It has succeeded in eroding civil liberties. It has succeeded in clogging the judicial system with non-crimes. It has succeeded in swelling prison populations with nonviolent offenders. It has succeeded in corrupting law enforcement. It has succeeded in fostering violence. It has succeeded in militarizing the police. It has succeeded in hindering legitimate pain management. It has succeeded in hampering the treatment of debilitating diseases. It has succeeded in making criminals out of hundreds of thousands of law-abiding Americans. It has succeeded in destroying America's inner cities. It has succeeded in unreasonably inconveniencing retail shopping. It has succeeded in destroying the black family. And the war on drugs has succeeded in wasting billions of taxpayer dollars. But even if none of these things were true, libertarians would still be right in what they say about the drug war. Let me give you 4 things that libertarians say about the drug war. Number 1, the war on drugs has financial and human costs that far exceed any of its supposed benefits. Number 2, the war on drugs is an assault on individual liberty, personal freedom, and property rights. Number 3, the war on drugs violates the Constitution, the principle of federalism, and increases the size and scope of government. It is on this last point that libertarians say that everyone ought to be standing with them when it comes to the drug war. How could anyone who said he believed in the Constitution support the federal government's war on drugs? Did not James Madison, the father of the Constitution, write in Federalist number 45, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." Does the Constitution authorize the national government to intrude itself into the personal eating, drinking, or smoking habits of Americans? Does the Constitution authorize the national government to regulate or prohibit the manufacture, sale, or use of any drug? Does the Constitution authorize the national government to restrict or monitor any harmful or mood-altering substances that any American wants to consume? When progressives in and out of the national government sought to prohibit the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors after World War I, they knew they could only do so by amending the Constitution. And that is why the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted in 1919. But thank God it was repealed in 1933. The libertarian position on the drug war may seem radical to some, but it is consistently and straightforwardly so. Number one, there should be no laws at any level of government for any reason regarding the buying, selling, growing, possessing, transporting, manufacturing, advertising, using, or possessing of any drug for any reason. Number two, it is not the proper role of government to prohibit, regulate, restrict, or otherwise control what a man desires to eat, drink, smoke, inject, snort, sniff, inhale, swallow, or otherwise ingest into his mouth, nose, veins, or lungs. Number three, the war on drugs should and could be ended immediately and completely. All drug laws should be repealed. All nonviolent drug offenders should be pardoned and released from prison. And all government agencies devoted to fighting the war on drugs should be eliminated. Number four, there should be a free market in drugs without any government interference, regulation, taxing, or licensing. This is the libertarian position on the drug war. And not only that, progressives and conservatives are not saying any of these things. Only libertarians are. In conclusion, I want to ask you two questions. Number one, and I want you to think about this. Who should decide what substance a legal adult puts into his mouth, nose, lungs, or veins? By supporting the war on drugs, you are saying that the government should decide. If it is the business of government to tell us what we can't put in our bodies, then what can't the government tell us that we can't do? If it is the business of government to tell us what we can't put in our bodies, then our bodies don't belong to us, they belong to the government. Second question, whose job is it to keep kids from using drugs? By supporting the war on drugs, you are saying it is the government's job. But if it is the job of government to keep kids safe from drugs, why is it not also the job of government to keep kids safe from violent video games, or from internet porn, or from high fructose corn syrup, or from risque movies, or from filthy music, or from raunchy novels, or subversive literature? Or perhaps keeping kids safe from these things is the job of parents, with the help, of course, of family, friends, churches, pastors, counselors, physicians, and support groups. If you're going to defend the evil that is the government's drug war in the name of protecting the children, then you can raise no rational objection and make no logical argument against the government doing anything in the name of protecting the children. I have told you what libertarians say about the drug war. So my question to you tonight is, what do you say? Not what does Spelman College say, not what does the NAACP say, not what does the ACLU say, not what does the Democratic Party say, not what does the Republican Party say. What do you say? Perhaps you don't use drugs and you don't intend to, and have therefore never thought about this issue. But perhaps you have a relative or know someone who has been unjustly incarcerated for a crime that has no victim. True freedom includes the freedom to engage in unhealthy, immoral, sinful, dangerous, destructive, or stupid behavior. True freedom includes the freedom to use medical marijuana or to simply get stoned out of your mind, as long as you don't violate the personal or property rights of others and you assume responsibility for the consequences of your actions. The war on drugs is ultimately not a political issue or a social issue or an economic issue or a cultural issue. The war on drugs is a freedom issue. The war on drugs is a war on freedom. Legalize freedom, legalize drugs. Thank you.